now some of those traits, like authenticity, like vulnerability, have almost become non-negotiable, right? The excuse is no longer, well, I'm just not that kind of leader, right? That's not
Right.
really an option anymore.
Like, things are changing so fast, and when in times of change, we know that people feel unstable, right?
Mhm.
So if you're a leader and you're trying to be performative,
Yeah.
that doesn't create a sense of stability. That doesn't create a sense of safety. That has people sort of questioning that lack of authenticity as truth or not.
Yeah.
Right? And whether they can trust you. And when we're almost like when we're running so fast, we have to be able to trust each other, right?
Yeah.
Or we don't have time for all the games that used to be played and things like that, because things are just moving too fast.
Yeah.
Change is how it is, right? It's every day, every hour, there's something new, and that we have to deal with, have to take on. And if you feel like you're on a treadmill and you're running and running and running, and you're not stopping to say, what have we accomplished? If you don't have a direction or a purpose that you can connect to that makes this all worth it, you're just going to get tired.
Because this is hard. The only reason we actually care about culture is because we got these pesky things called people inside our organizations, and humans are human, and humans behave in unpredictable ways. I mean, if all we had was artificially intelligent robots inside our organization, nobody would be even talking about culture.
It's a gift to that person if they're not on board, to give them the clarity so they can go do something they can be passionate about.
There's a difference between certainty, which feels really good in the short term and can be a bit of a sugar high, and it's what a lot of political leaders try to provide us with, and all of that kind of stuff, but also what a lot of business leaders try to do. And clarity, which is, this is a clear-eyed, truthful, realistic assessment of where I believe we're at, and what we need to, and what we think we need to do in order to be able to get there.
But the reality is being able to say, we don't know, but we're figuring it out, or we will figure it out. We don't know, but we know where we're going, and we're working on getting there. And or we don't know, and here's when we think we'll know more.
Hi, welcome to our Humanity Working interview series. Now, if you spent any time studying leadership, you might have come across Sonya Shelton's work, and specifically her Amazon bestseller, You're an Executive, but Are You a Leader? It's totally worth a read. It captures, I'd say, like an enduring set of capabilities that are essential in anybody who wants to not just have a title, but successfully lead a team or an organization. And let's face it, if you're going to retain that title, you need to successfully lead a team or an organization. Now, Sonya and I first met a couple of years ago, and we nearly recorded a podcast back then, but we've caught up again recently, and I realized that we just really had to get her on, because her thinking has evolved recently to reflect this new world of work. And also, I'd say, beyond what individual leaders to do, but up to and including how organizations need to be built. So a couple of years late, but better late than never. Welcome to the podcast, Sonya.
Thank you. I'm excited for our conversation today.
Yeah, I am too. Let's dive right in. So you wrote the book that I'm referring to. We'll include a link to it in the show notes, obviously. But you wrote that book about a decade ago, I think. And many of the themes in it are absolutely timeless. But we've had a huge technical transformation since then, massive societal shifts, and there was that little thing called a pandemic. So from where you sit, what do you think has fundamentally shifted about work in the last few years?
So I think it's, back then when I wrote the book, it was about leaders focusing on alignment, right?
Hmm.
Having one vision, one voice, one direction. And I think as things have evolved, through pandemic, through AI, through a lot of economic uncertainty, back then we used to do 3 year strategic plans, right?
Hmm.
And now
I
I
remember
advise
those.
my clients, like, let's hit some strategic areas of focus and really be agile as we're going through the process, because things are changing so fast that we really can't see um, as far into the future as we used to be able to. And because of that, both leaders and organizations, how they do on the humanity working side, needs to change and evolve to accommodate that.
Yeah, it's wild, isn't it? I mean, it used to be my job to help create those 3 year, 5 year, sometimes even 5 year plans. And now I look back on that and go, did that ever make sense? I'm not, but it certainly doesn't make sense now. So you touched on it a little bit, but given those shifts, what do you think if you were to think about it in terms of almost like leadership traits? A lot of that book that you talk about really you could you could refer to them as leadership traits that are referenced in the original book. What what do you think leadership does need to look like now, especially compared to how you outlined it in your book, but also the models that many leaders have grown up with, as it were?
Yeah. So I think all of those. So I wrote 50 chapters. That
Hmm.
sounds crazy. They're 3 pages each, right? So one is, what is that leadership capability or skill that's
Hmm.
necessary, and what is it and why do you need it? And then an example of a case study of how it's was put into practice, and then the coaching questions that I would ask around that to develop it, right? So it was
Hmm.
really designed to, yes, you can read it from front to back, but you can also just say, well, this is what I'm dealing with now and I need some coaching on this, and have it really be a quick tip.
Yeah.
All of those 50 things still apply today. I think it's a yes and, right? Right. So it's
Yeah.
all of that. And now there's other things that we need to do in addition to that to deal with, the environment that we're in.
Yeah. I mean, my observation going through it again for this discussion was that it's that they are timeless in many ways, but it is interesting that there are different ones that appear to have sort of like come to the fore. It's almost like a difference in emphasis, as it were. I was
Mhm.
really struck, for example, about how you talked about things like authenticity and vulnerability back then, and today, like you never hear. It's almost like you never hear about anything else, right?
Right.
And so it's really intriguing that we approach some of these things like they're brand new. They did they did exist, but as the world changes, as society changes, and particularly as the business climate changes and becomes more uncertain and ambiguous and so on, and as the way we present ourselves changes and the rise of social media and things like that, it just causes some of these things to need to be emphasized more. The other thing that struck me about it as well was that um, I love the way you put it. Right, I almost imagine like the book could be a set of cards. You know, you pick up a card, you pick up a card, and on one side would be a description of it, and on the other side would be your coaching questions and your case study and things like that. Um, and you'd pick out different cards, or you'd focus on more on more cards now. But because it was structured in the way that it was, and because you were thinking about it in the way that it was, um, some things might be more important. Some things would almost be, I wouldn't say completely optional, but you could de-emphasize. Now, some of those traits, like authenticity, like vulnerability, um, have almost become non-negotiable. Right? The excuse is no longer, well, I'm just not that kind of leader. Right?
Right.
That's not really an option anymore. Do you agree with that? And B, what do you what do you think about that evolution and almost like why we are where we are?
I think as humans, that's the only way that we can keep up, right?
Mm-hmm.
With the pace of change. Like things are changing so fast. And when in times of change, we know that people feel unstable, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you're a leader and you're trying to be performative, that
Yeah.
doesn't create a sense of stability. That doesn't create a sense of safety. That has people sort of questioning that lack of authenticity as truth or not,
Yeah.
right? And whether they can trust you. And when we're almost like when we're running so fast, we have to be able to trust each other, right? Right?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
we don't have time for all the games that used to be played and things like that because things are just moving too fast.
Gosh, that's interesting and I think profoundly important. Um, I went back over some polling we did of employees. This is about a year and a half ago, something along those lines, and um, we we did something very simple that ended up being really kind of profound. We asked employees to describe their feelings about work in a single word. So they had to like select a single word. And the only prompting that we did was that we wanted something that was like a feeling, like an emotional response. So not like accountant,
Right.
or something along those lines. And I suspect that what we did a year and a half ago would not really have changed, but the types of words that bubbled up on aggregate were words like tired, exhausted, overwhelmed, um, uncertain, ambiguous, scared, you know, like a lot of those words and very little of excited or passionate or thrilled or any of those types of words. And I think that that's when you think about what that takes to be a leader in an environment where the people you are leading are often expressing those types of sentiments, which are sort of like single word acknowledgments of a form of low level burnout,
Yeah.
then simply kind of like trotting out a phrase that you're excited about X or excited about Y when they can see in your eyes that you're not, or um, or simply urging people to do more with less for the seventh year in a row is is likely not to cut it anymore, right?
Right. Yeah, and I think to build on that, we're seeing the research of the millennial generation, 80% having anxiety about work. That's
Yeah,
astounding, right? Um and I think it is part of this speed of change, uncertainty. There's no stability there, right? And change used to be, when I wrote the book, change was an event, right? Right now,
yeah,
change is how it is, right? It's every day, every hour, there's something new, and that we have to deal with, have to take on. And if you feel like you're on a treadmill and you're
hmm,
running and running and running, and you're not stopping to say, what have we accomplished? If you don't have a direction or a purpose that you can connect to that makes this all worth it, you're just going to get tired, right? It's like running on a treadmill going nowhere. There doesn't seem to be a destination, and that's not fun, right? Right?
yeah,
That's not going to bring in those words that you mentioned, like exciting, passionate, things like that.
yeah. And I think this is I've been struggling with this a little bit myself in terms of trying to figure out what all of this means, because you could look at this and go, well, you know what? I mean, in general, people tend to get a little bit more, I don't know, cynical as they progress in the workplace. Um, and you could look at certain aspects of the workplace and say that they're a lot better. I mean, there's a lot more flexibility in the workplace than there used to be. A lot of people get to do work that is potentially much more meaningful than it was when when you just had a very rigid, very strict job description. Um, and we do occasionally hear, particularly from senior leaders, was like, "What's everybody moaning about?" In my day, it was X or X or Y or Z. Why can't they have the level of passion or excitement that employees once had? Um, but I kind of think it is fundamentally different. It does seem to me, at least in the work that we've done, that it is fundamentally different. Um, do you think the flexibility and the freedom that we've created in the workplace is that all good, or is there an aspect of it that is causing employees to struggle with going to work excited each day?
I think it varies. I think
Hmm.
it varies by individual. I think it also varies by how people are leading. So
Yeah,
what I've seen, you know, leading or managing people who have that flexibility, like if they're working remote, um, if it's a hybrid situation, if all the different permutations that we see of
yeah.
workplace now, I hear leaders complain like, well, we don't have that personal connection that we used to have when we were
Hmm.
all in person. And and I think that what's missing is the being intentional about that personal connection. If you
Right.
have if you have uh, employees that are dispersed, you have to intentionally create that conversation that happens as you're walking into the conference room for the meeting and everyone's chatting, right? To You have to be intentional about that, as opposed to, okay, it's on the hour, let's start the meeting, here's the agenda, here's the objectives, not really
Yeah.
giving people a chance to connect. So I think there is, in this environment, things that we used to take for granted that we have to
Yeah.
be intentional about now.
I think that's exactly right. In our work, we talk about it as though you used to get some things for free that you never really thought about or spoke about. So, for example, like the idea that there would be a personal, in-person human connection between employees that worked in the same space at the same time was something we never used to even have to think about or talk about, because that was a built-in feature of the way that work was. What's really interesting now is that if you walk into a workplace today, even if you pull everybody back into the office and you walk into a workplace today, and then you'll see people with their headsets on, and they can talk to the people. They can be sat next to a human being that's within 3 feet or 4 feet of them, and not be working with them, and sometimes not even communicating with them. I've mentioned it on this pod before, but we've encountered people who have worked for months or years or more and not communicated with the people that are in the same physical space as them, because
Wow.
at least from that perspective there was no reason to. And so we are in a that's just it's just one example of a situation where it's fundamentally changed. So I love the way you phrase it, because there's what's changed is like everything. The what, the when, the where, the why, the how of work, it's all changed. And because all of those things have changed, that's changed what we get for free and what we need to be intentional about. Now, you talk in the you talked in your original work, and I know you've mentioned this in your work since, that a lot of the a lot of that ability to be able to lead people effectively starts from within. And I want to touch on that a little bit, because It relates to a couple of the other guests that we've had on recently that have really spoken about this. Right, I can't excite and engage and rally people around the mission unless I myself am I've found my reason, and I can't fake that. So let's start with something super simple. If you're working, let's say with a leadership team versus an individual leader, but if you're working with a leadership team and you're looking to create the sort of strategy that is going to be adaptive strategy that is going to help the organization move forward and excel, and you're looking to start with injecting some kind of passion for the leadership team around it, where do you start?
Yeah, and I like how you asked that question because it does touch on, I think, an insight that I had in this evolution of work that we've seen,
Yeah.
where it was before, we might be brought in for strategic planning, is a different conversation than working on leadership or organizational culture or even organization design.
Mm-hmm.
And what I realized is these functions don't talk to each other in an organization, and we think about culture as something that's completely separate from the business. Right? And but for a powerful culture really should enhance the business performance, right?
Yeah.
So so I say that to say that's where we start, right? We start with, what is your purpose? What is your why? And we look at that at 3 concentric levels. So working at a leadership team, looking at it from a personal individual perspective, right? What is your superpower? Why do you do what you do? How do you deliver on that? How do you internally process information? What do you want other people to expect from you? Right. So that's our first stop, is looking at that why at the individual level, even at the leadership team level. Why do we exist as a leadership team? What are we trying to do together as a leadership team? So that starts to break down silos, starts to see themselves as a leadership team, not a group of individual leaders that are leading separate parts of the organization. And then what is an organization is our purpose, right? So why do we exist as an organization? How do we deliver on that? What do we want our customers or clients to expect from us? And the reason why we start there is exactly because of what's happened in the environment. Because I realized when the most stressful things that happen in our personal lives, some of the most stressful things, something like getting married, something like moving to a new house, those are very stressful events, right?
Yeah.
But and there's stress involved, but we know the destination we know why we're stressed. We know why we're doing. We see the other side of how happy we're going to be on the other side of it. And when we get there, and started saying, like, how can we build some of that into how we look at work, right? And how we look at business, to say, if we have a really strong purpose, then those stressful moments have meaning, right?
Yeah.
And we have the resilience to be able to get through it when we know why we're doing it. And and sometimes it doesn't even feel like stress. Sometimes it can feel like excitement. right. And like if we didn't know why, it would feel like stress, but because we know why, we're excited about what we're doing, even though it's hard.
Yeah.
And so we always start with purpose.
Yeah, it's almost, in a sense, creating that startup feeling within a larger organization, right? Like, how we, in our own tiny little way, how are we going to change the world? And it's difficult to do a startup without any sense of purpose. You get found out very, very quickly. But create that feeling of excitement as to what the future can be can be, I think, extraordinarily powerful. You mentioned about the intertwining of culture and strategy there. I I know that you've mentioned before that that whole culture eats strategy for breakfast is a thing you do not subscribe to. So you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yes, yes. So I'm a big fan of Peter Drucker, but we
Yeah.
disagree.
Hmm.
I don't believe that culture eats strategy for breakfast. I don't believe that strategy eats culture for breakfast, and I
Hmm.
think that is why in most organizations they see each other as very separate, right?
Yeah.
And depending on who you're talking to, one is more important than the other. But I what I say is they need to have breakfast together, right? So
Hmm.
so how can you bring these things together to support each other? So even when I was just talking about purpose, it sounds like, oh, it's just all about the team and all about the team connecting to the purpose and having that passion for the purpose. Well, it's also about the customer, because if a lot you have a lot more brand loyalty when people are buying from you and they're connected to your purpose. They understand why you exist. They understand that you care about them, and the world that you're trying to create for them, right? Whatever it is that you do, right? And they start to feel that too, right? So it's an internal and external purpose that builds the business as well as strengthens the culture.
Yeah. This this got me thinking actually when I was rereading the book about the the relationship the the relationship that we often separate into between different things that maybe should not be separated, or at least not separated in a classic way. So what I mean by that is that there's this sort of there's this sort of discipline around organizational design that can encompass, although it's not fully restricted to, but can encompass things like what's your organizational structure, for example. There's this discipline around organizational strategy. There's this discipline, which is largely sitting inside HR around culture and human growth and things like that. And then there's this discipline around leading, around the behaviors of leaders, which is typically, senior executive coaching and things like that, is how you kind of go about making sure it happens inside an organization. But your point just now about how we separate a lot of these things out, but in reality, I suppose when you think about it, um, elements like organizational structure are deeply entwined with the the way in which an organization is going to function, and deeply entwined into things like the culture of an organization. I was thinking, for example, your uh, the question that popped in my head when you were just describing it was like, some organizations have a chief culture officer, or they may not call it that, but they have something equivalent to that. But maybe that's a bad thing, right? Because that structural decision to have somebody who's, in quotes, responsible for the culture is also isolating it from something that should be permeating the entire organization. So I know with your red thread leadership model that you use now, I find that really interesting because it encompasses some things like the structure of the organization and the processes that are inside the organization. But at its heart, it's partly how organizations should be built, but you could think of it from a different perspective as a set of things that leaders do, leadership behaviors. So, do you spend a lot of time thinking about how these things are separate, should be separate, are intertwined, should be intertwined?
Yeah, I think it came probably a frustration, frankly, of what culture means. It's that
Hmm.
that old story about the elephant, the people
Yeah,
touching the different parts of the elephant think it's something different. I think
yeah.
that's describes culture to a T. That people think
Well,
it's something different.
before we go any further, I'll tell you what. Why don't you tell me what to illustrate that? Why don't you tell me what you think it is, and I'll tell you the definition that we use.
Yeah. So
So,
so I think it is everything that touches behavior,
mm,
right? So in the red thread model, we start with purpose, as I mentioned. And then we go, so there's 5 P's. The second P is plan. So that's your vision, your strategy, your goals. That impacts culture. And then we look at processes, um, whether processes are efficient, functional, understood, clear. That impacts culture, right? So if processes aren't clear and you have bad behavior happening, right?
yeah.
It's not because of the people; it's because of the process, right?
Hmm.
And then looking at positions, which would be organization design, how decisions are made, how people are rewarded, how they're promoted, how they're hired, all those decisions around positions also impacts culture. And then there's I think the common definition we call passion. Others
Yeah.
might call engagement um, or just might call culture, which is around the emotion, right? Like how am I connected to the organization? How am I connected to my role? Am I passionate about what I'm doing? Am I passionate about the company I work for? And all of these things can be measured, right?
Yeah.
So and we do measure them. So it is really all of those aspects, because I think what sometimes frustrates leaders is they focus on the behavior part, or they focus on the benefits or the perks or whatever it is, and say, well, why isn't that making people happy? But maybe it's a
Mm,
process breakdown, and that's causing arguments or conflicts between people that they're not even thinking is part of culture.
yeah. Yeah. We're hugely aligned on that. We define culture. We do use the word behavior when it comes to culture, but we define it precisely as how people behave in the organization when no one's looking.
Hmm.
And but very, very much we've seen that the things that can influence that are incredibly multifaceted. And if you're thinking that, I don't know, just putting a new procedure in place that if people read they'll forget a day later,
Hmm.
will change how people behave, or even raising salaries might change it, or adopting a policy of around vacation days will change it. They may well change it, but they can easily change it in ways you do not expect, right? There may be a whole bunch of unintended consequences associated with it. um, and so part of the reason why I love your model is that, as I say, it captures a set of things that ultimately leaders need to do inside organizations in order to be able to have an impact on how the organization functions. Because it's hard. The only reason we actually care about culture is because we got these pesky things called people inside our organizations, and humans are human, and humans behave in unpredictable ways. I mean, if all we had was artificially intelligent robots inside our organization, nobody would be even talking about culture, right?
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, so we have to, but we do have to figure that out, and that means that we have to figure out what the holistic experience is of the humans inside our organization. So when we started this discussion, we were talking about how that holistic human experience has changed inside organizations, and it is radically different to what it used to be. Um, if you're working with leaders today, and you're thinking about you're thinking with them about what the experience is for employees, middle managers, senior leaders inside organizations. Um, what if anything, do you think is fundamentally different about that feeling of going to work now?
Yeah, I think one of the phrases I use a lot is clarity polarizes, right? So that
Mm,
people understand if they're in or if they're out when you're clear.
yeah.
And what I find is a lot of times leaders are just trying to make everybody happy, and so they don't really say right, so
Yeah.
they don't create role clarity, they don't create vision clarity, they don't create purpose clarity, because what if somebody doesn't like it and then maybe they might leave, as opposed to
Mm,
saying this is where we're trying to go as a business. And the clearer we are about that, it's a gift to that person if they're not on board, to
yeah.
give them the clarity so they can go do something they can be passionate about, right? And we can help them with that. But
Yeah.
the key that I see, especially now, I think with with that burnout, with anxiety, with all the uncertainty and the speed, is just a lack of clarity and willing to um, make a decision, take a stand, right, right, and
Yeah.
say this is who we are and where we're going. And of course, we're going to have to make adjustments along the way as we um, as things change in the environment and the business changes. We always have to be flexible and agile and all those things. But this is the direction we're going, and this is who we are and why we do what we do, even to the values, right? And being willing to be okay with people not being okay with that, right? And
Yeah.
so I think it is, when I designed Red Thread was really around, how can we make this connection between the head and the heart and to each other,
Mm,
right? So there's the red thread comes from different cultures, have different ways of describing it. um and one of them is, I think it's Theseus goes to find the Minotaur and has a red thread to get him outside of the maze, right? So
yeah.
how can we get through this maze of complexity and speed and uncertainty that we're dealing with? And then in Asian culture, they say there's a vein that runs from your heart to your hand, and then it turns invisible to connect to all the people that you're supposed to make magic with, right?
Yeah.
And so like those two examples are why I called it red thread, and also kind of the heart of what it's about, right? Um to be able to make sense of the environment that we're in, to be able to have that
Hmm.
purpose and where we fit, and then also to be able to connect with each other to make it happen in a way that is more fulfilling, and can also be a lot faster when we're clear.
Yeah. I want to go a little bit deeper on that clarity concept. Actually, it reminds me of a discussion we had recently with Bob Johansson from the Institute for the Future about this exact issue. Um, the Institute for the Future's work is very closely centered around this concept of BANI now: brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible. The sort of update to VUCA, I guess you could call it. And um, there's this interesting challenge here whereby many businesses are, to the point about 3-year plans of earlier on, are navigating a whole bunch of elements that are reflected in what I just said: brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible. So they're navigating a business climate that is deeply unpredictable. And if they're pretending that they're not, then they're kidding themselves and or others. So what Bob talks about, which I think is extremely important, is that there's a difference between certainty, which is almost impossible in the world in which we sit today, as in at this point in 3 years time we will be here and it will look like this and we will have exactly these number of employees and we will have exactly these groups and it will blah 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 and everybody jump on the boat with me, and then 6 months later going, well, that didn't work, but in 3 years time we'll be here. That kind of thing. There's a difference between certainty, which feels really good in the short term and can be a bit of a sugar high, and it's what a lot of political leaders try to provide us with, and and all of that kind of stuff, but also what a lot of business leaders try to do. And clarity, which is, this is a clear-eyed, truthful, realistic assessment of where I believe we're at and what we need to, and what we think we need to do in order to be able to get there. So I'm curious, I believe, and I'm curious to get your take on this, that like, I don't have all the answers can be part of delivering clarity. Do you agree with that statement? And what do you think the implications are for leaders if you do agree with that statement? What do you think the implications are?
Yes. So I 100% agree with certainty versus clarity. And like you said, those 3-year plans don't exist anymore. So we might not know how we're going to get there, but we can say where we're going.
Yes.
Right. So, and we can say who
and
we are.
and why, ideally.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And
yeah.
we can say, here's our purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what we want to create in the world. This is who we want to be in the future. And we're going to map a direction towards that. And that might change, right? How we get there might change. Because, if you imagine we're going on a trip and say we take a car, right? Then, okay, we're going to take a car. There might be some road closures. There might be some traffic. The GPS is going to tell us where to go, or maybe we need to stop because we're tired, right? Right. So all of those things happen when you're on a journey, right? And not being afraid of them, and to say that, yes, these things are going to happen. We may not know even when they're going to happen, but this is the direction that we're going. That's the clarity I'm talking about, right? So that, and then people can know, if I'm making a decision, does this move us forward to where we're trying to get to or not? Right. And I think what I'm seeing increase probably in the past 2 years, I would say, but definitely more in the past year, is leaders being afraid to make decisions.
Yes.
Because they don't have the certainty.
Yeah.
Right. So they're not providing clarity because they're afraid of being uncertain and not having the certainty. And just to say, like, this is where we're going to start, and then we're going to see what happens. That's the agile leadership way, right? Is to say, okay, we're going to try something and then we're going to adjust. Right. And we recognize that things might happen that make us throw that away altogether because something's changed. And that's where we are. But our destination, where we're trying to get to, and our vision is consistent.
Yeah. It's so funny. I wonder how much of this is, we might have always been wrong about how we did this stuff, and it's just like this new environment exposes just how wrong we are. Because the mental model that I've seen best work for leaders is almost like you're the captain of a ship in let's say an old school sailing ship, and you're going around the Cape of Good Hope on your way to India from, say, Portugal or something along those lines, right? If that's what you're doing, if you're doing sort of the equivalent of that, right? There's the expectation of your crew that, like, the boat's going to get blown off course, or you're going to have to do some different things in order to be able to accomplish the overall goal that you have. And at some point, who knows, you might not get all the way there, and you might have to land at at some other port and do something different, right, associated with it. But you're not going to have a successful captain of that ship who's like, well, it's going to be smooth sailing the entire way, and there's not going to be and there's not going to be any wind, and if there is, you can fire me, right? I mean, it doesn't work. So I think my point here is that we sort of would behave in the past as though things were entirely predictable when they probably never were, but we would be wrong enough infrequently enough that we could sort of get away with it. And now that is entirely and completely exposed, and so we have to behave in a different way. But many leaders are deeply uncomfortable doing that. Hence, they get caught in the things like the analysis paralysis, because they feel more comfortable projecting certainty versus clarity of mission.
Right. Yeah, and I think using your analogy, the ship is probably...
I hope it works. I made that up on the spot, but
it's probably like, I know it's the same with planes, so I'm guessing it's probably even more so with ships, right? That most of the time they're off course.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
They're constantly adjusting to what's happening, right? So,
well, and ironically, back in the 17th or 18th century, they wouldn't even entirely know where they were, right, at various points. And that is true in business, right? We don't always exactly, because our metrics are retrospective, and sometimes we don't see, business headwinds until, we're 2 months into them or something like that. So sometimes some of our measures are retrospective versus prospective, and so we don't even really know where in the ocean we are at any one point.
And I think that's key. Is I think that sometimes you leaders want to be so buttoned up, right?
Yeah.
And have it all together and have all the answers. And part of the issue is that people put them on this pedestal like they should know everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they want to live up to that, right?
Yeah,
But the reality is being able to say, we don't know, but we're figuring it out, or we will figure it out. We don't know, but we know where we're going, and we're working on getting there. And or we don't know, and here's when we think we'll know more.
Yes.
And just to be able to do that actually creates a lot of stability in an organization where people
and can increase trust as well, which is, I know, is a key pillar for you as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And to say the like, I've got you, right? Yeah. I'm real. I'm with you. I've got you. I'm not pretending that it's something other, because the pretending, again, back to authenticity from the beginning, right? Is that performative way. People see through it. They know. they can feel it. They can feel like you're towing the company line or using a corporate communications sentence about it. And they can feel that, and then they start making things up. So if you're just clear and just say, this is how it is, and you're willing to be vulnerable, and transparent, then that actually creates more trust and stability in the organization, because they're not spinning, trying to figure out what's really going on.
Yeah. Yeah. Here's what we know. Here's what we know. Here's what we don't know. Here's what we're going to try and find out. All of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Okay. So a lot's changed as we've discussed. And a lot of your work, as you say, is now sort of centered around the things that leaders need to build, if you like, if they're building an organization that is going to be successful. I keep wanting to go back to the ship analogy, right? They want to build this seafaring vessel, as it were, to navigate these waters. But if you were, I guess my most interesting question right now is, if you were to design an organization from scratch, and for the environment that we face right now, what would be the principles or the structures that you would insist on right from the start? Because many organizations, when they first begin, they defer a whole bunch of stuff until they're big enough to worry about it. But I want you to sort of imagine that you're inside an organization that's not a startup necessarily, but a larger organization, but you're pretending as though you're starting from scratch. If you started from scratch, where would you start? What would you focus on first?
So again, I would focus on purpose, right?
Mm-hmm.
And those first two, purpose and plan. So
Yeah.
why do we exist? Um, what makes us different?
Yeah.
And what where do we want to take this? Like where do we want to go? What's our time horizon? It doesn't have to be, you know, a 20-year vision. It can be a 1-year vision, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But clear about where we're going, and then designing everything else around getting there.
Yeah.
Right. And what I find is really empowering people. When you're clear like that, you can empower them to question, is this getting us there? So
Yeah.
this happens a lot in process, where, you know, there's processes there where, you know, I hear this, I think I even talk about it in the book, right? Where like, oh, we've been doing this forever. We've always done it this way.
Yeah.
Okay, why did you do it this way? Well, because Maria liked to see it this way, or she liked to get this particular report. Okay, so Maria doesn't work here anymore. Right.
Yeah.
So why? So what is this actually doing? Well, I don't know. Nobody ever. We just continue to do it that way because that's how we've always done it. Um,
Yeah.
but really, to empower people to question every aspect, to say, is everything that I'm doing moving us in this direction? And I am empowered to question, and it's okay for me to question if this is valuable use of my time, or is this the right process? And then at the next level, which is something I'm really focused on with organizations who are ready for it, not every organization's ready for it, is to really create synergy among teams, to say,
Mm.
this is beyond collaboration. It's more about, I'm looking at your goals and seeing how I can benefit from helping you with your goals, so that we both win and the customer wins, right?
Yeah.
So really trying to um, build more of that shared ownership in how we work together, and how, you know, that can really create exponential results when you have, it's not just I'm helping you and I'm collaborating with you. It's really like, how can I help you in a way that also helps me and helps the customer?
Yeah.
And and that's also going to differentiate us, and it's a lot of fun, and it's going to help us get to where we're going faster.
Mm. So interesting. I've noticed in some of your work you've talked about how like old school views of what collaboration is don't really apply anymore, and I could not concur with that more, at least in part because the way in which we collaborate in this new world of technology driven is very superficial in many ways. And there have been some things that allow us to be able to do superficial collaboration really well, but deep, sort of embedded forms of collaboration have become, like I would say, de-optimized as more shallow forms of collaboration have become optimized. And I think that's a challenge inside some organizations. And then your discussion about purpose, I got a very simple question for you, and I'm curious to see whether you've seen what we've seen. When you ask a company a question of along the lines of either why do you exist, or directly what is your purpose, what do you want to accomplish, or even what do you do and why, um, do you find sometimes even at a senior level inside organizations people struggle to answer that question?
100%. And in
Yeah.
fact, the most common answer I get, our purpose is to make money.
Mm.
Right.
Which I suppose, at a incredibly superficial way, yeah. I mean, that's sort of a definition of capitalism, I suppose, isn't it? But it's but it's the same for any profit making enterprise. So it doesn't really tell you. It tells you everything and nothing at the same time, doesn't it?
Right.
Yeah.
And my comeback is always, well, okay, great. Let's go to your customer.
Yeah.
And we're going to say, we want you to buy this because we want to make money, and see how that goes.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. But that's actually really profound. Just a very brief story. When I was in my last role at Microsoft, it was I was doing an internal startup inside Microsoft, and it was centered around clinical research. And for 4 or 5 months, we kind of struggled with our framing our purpose in the right way. And what we realized after about 4 or 5 months is like every articulation, every version we come up about it was about us. It was about, oh, Microsoft could, if we do this right, then Microsoft could get a new line of business and some additional Azure revenue associated with clinical research, which they've never had before. Right. And even though we were dressing it up in certain ways for our customers, what they were sensing was like, oh, Microsoft's interested in this space because it basically doesn't make any money there today and it would like to tomorrow. Well, to your point, right, that didn't actually particularly land. and so we actually had to go through and do an exercise that is very similar to what you're talking about and ask ourselves what was the underlying reason why we wanted to create this, why we wanted to build this. And it turned into accelerating the speed with which we could bring life-saving therapies to market. And the moment that we made that shift, which in those circles, there's a time thing that's called from lab to jab. And it just basically means, from when the idea arrives to the point at which, it can actually start saving people's lives. Once we started focusing on that and talking about that, then our business tripled. And it seemed like such a simple thing because it was about how we spoke about stuff, but it relates back to everything you're talking about around authenticity and all of those kind of things as well. All right. I got one last question for you.
Okay.
So years and years back, you were a senior executive at Disney. And I know, from talking to you that some of the principles that are in your book are infused by that time at Disney, and as we've said, many of those are timeless. But we're now at this moment where all of the stuff that we've been talking about is changing work, plus AI, automation, robotics are reshaping really how work gets done. You've always consistently throughout all of this stuff, you've emphasized things like purpose and clarity and connection and things of that nature. How do you think you would talk to your former self at Disney, and what would you tell your former self at Disney to focus on in this moment to make sure that the sort of human elements of leadership are kept at the center as AI becomes a bigger part of how organization operates?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. First, I'll preface it with, I worked at Disney in times that were the best of times, mm-hmm. and in times that were the worst of times. So is that
Nicholas Nickleby? Did they do that? Did they do a version of Nicholas Nickleby? I think they probably
did. in that I was there when Disney's culture was exalted as the one to look at, and in a lot of ways it was, right. And And on the other side, I was there during a shareholder revolt when a member of the Disney family
Ooh.
ousted our CEO. I was the head of internal communications globally in a company going through basically a divorce, right? So, so I'll preface it with that context
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
say I think it's really about I would tell myself then in the best of times to pay attention to why this works.
Mm.
Right. And that's sort of a lot of the things that I've developed since has gone back to what were we doing? What was that about? Why was that successful? Why was Disney so successful at that time? And why was everyone looking to that company to try to figure out what we were doing? Right,
Yeah.
right. And so,
Yeah.
so a lot of what I've done is sort of go back to those times and say, what was happening in the company? What did we do? And then I would tell myself in the worst of times, pay attention to this moment because this is going to start happening a lot for companies, and you can help, right? So,
Right.
so I think it is, it was a very stressful time in the shareholder revolt. There was a ton of uncertainty, right? Right. There was
Yeah.
everything was up in the air. We had and a lot of distraction and a lot of anxiety, and so it was almost like those two things prepared me for what I would do in the future. And I think it's, really being clear about that and paying attention when things are working and asking the question why and not just celebrating, and paying attention to when it's not working and asking why and figuring out how to get out. Right.
Wonderful. Yeah. I think you're basically saying that like running a company like now is like, I don't know, being on the west coast of Ireland. If it looks one way and the right now the weather will change in 10 minutes, it's kind
Right.
of it's kind of like that, and we have to be prepared for that. And I think that's a great place to leave us today. I want to thank you so much for this kind of weird conversation that I tried to orchestrate and went off in a weird direction on boats, but hopefully it made sense. Hopefully it made sense to people, and we'll, as I say, we'll put the link to your book, which is really timeless, as I say, and also to the rest of your really interesting work in the show notes. So thank you so much for joining us today, Sonya.
Thank you. I loved our conversation. Thanks for having me.